Software Engineering Radio, episode 127, interview with Joachim Machate on usability.
This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions and interviews on software engineering topics every 10 days. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for support.
Okay, welcome listeners to another episode of Software Engineering Radio. This time we're talking about usability and design issues. Our guest today is Joachim Machate from UID.
Thank you.
Why don't you introduce yourself and your company a little bit so people know who they're listening to?
Okay, fine. My name is Joachim Machate, as you said, and I'm working at User Interface Design, which is a company offering usability services. A few words about myself. I have studied computer science at the University of Stuttgart. This is in Germany, and I've been working at Fraunhofer Association, at the Fraunhofer Institute for ergonomics, also in Stuttgart. Later, I've been with IBM as a visiting scientist. And my first subject was about speech recognition and speech understanding, the management of natural language systems. Mm-hmm. So the subject of my PhD was how to use the intonation of spoken dialogues in order to drive a dialogue between a system and a user. But this was in the early years, in the 90s, so it's some years ago. And after that I started with human-computer interaction. This was also at Fraunhofer Society, and now since about 9 years I'm with UID. I'm responsible here first for the software development team and also for a market branch which we call Enterprise Solutions. This is a market branch dealing with enterprise software for the financial sector, for assurance companies, for instance, or also for with software tools like IDEs or something like that.
Yeah. Our audience is relatively technical, so they probably know 5 programming languages each. And they probably don't know much about usability engineering and human-computer interaction and all that, this space of stuff. So please give us an introduction about what usability engineering is and why it is relevant.
Okay, before I start with that, I just want to say a few words about UID. So what is the mission of our company? And the full name of UID is User Interface Design. So UID is the abbreviation. Yeah. And User Interface Design, this is exactly what we offer. This is services about how to design, how to model a user interface, but also how to program it. And we offer these services to a very broad range of applications, starting from the enterprise solutions, which I already mentioned, but also to consumer goods like a mobile phone or a DVD recorder or something like that. Also ticket selling automaton, or in the industry sector for welding machines, for instance, or in the car manufacturing industry, automotive engineering, things like that. And the idea of the foundation of the company was that if a psychologist and a computer scientist, if they try to work together, they should be able to build more or say better user interfaces with respect to how they meet the requirements of the users. And this is basically what is usability is about, is how can we better meet the requirements that the users have? How can we can we develop products that fit to the goals, to the tasks that the user have? So it's always about the users. That is what usability is about. Asks the user about their tasks, asks the user about the goals, and also know the user profiles, know about their education and things like that. So
in some sense, it's a counterpoint to the typically technical engineering driven development process, where you kind of advocate the user of the system.
Right. It's not functional driven, or although the functions should be chosen in a way that they meet the tasks and goals of the user.
And you already talked about your enterprise solutions part, and you talked about appliances. So before we delve into the details about how usability engineering applies to software, you maybe want to talk about the overall scope a little bit. I mean, it's actually really broad. You look at hardware, you look at software, and how it interacts, I guess.
So your question is about a more holistic view of holistic product view.
Yeah.
So it's not only software inside a product. For instance, if you think about embedded systems, take ticket automaton, it's not only the software inside the ticket automaton, but it's also the hardware, and it's all the buttons on the hardware, the display which is used, and so it's the complete product. And usability engineering not only deals with the usability aspect of the software, but also how the software and hardware, how this is integrated. Consider, for instance, soft keys, and so you can easily think of how the display must be designed that it's obvious for the user which labels are related to a certain soft key, etc.
So from your perspective, what is easier? You get a piece of hardware, like let's say the iPhone, and you design an application so that it runs on that hardware, given its hardware buttons and stuff? Or is it easier if you get a task and maybe a piece of software to design the hardware around it? Is there any prejudice which one is easier, or?
It's hard to say which one is easier. Of course, the interaction designers always like the most degree of freedom. So if we just have the task to design a system which should meet some specific user goals, and we are free in designing also the hardware and the number of keys you use and things, that's always better, and it's of course it's always more joy for the interaction.
And I guess this leads to this whole topic whether it's good to have a generic device that then runs all kinds of software, or whether it's better to have maybe several specific devices.
So it's a heavily discussed issue, whether you should have dedicated devices with only a minor number of functions, or whether you have this unique device which serves almost everything. So do you really want to watch TV with your mobile, or is this such a question? Some people like it, and others just want to make a phone call. And
those people still exist. If I'm putting myself into the role of a typical software developer, and I know maybe a development process like the rational process, or maybe some agile stuff, how from 10,000 feet does the usability engineering fit in? Where do I need to talk to a usability guy?
As soon as possible. So right in the beginning, you should ask the users and get a picture of what your target group is and what they want to do. So this is basically in the requirements phase, or even sooner, so that you really know who are your users, what do they want to do, and what is their background. And also you need to know the environment in which your product should be used. So if it's not just software running on an ordinary PC or on a laptop or whatever, but think about medical devices, or in industries, construction, or welding machine or things like that. So you need to know about the of what we call the context of use, and the context of use is a very important very important information for the interaction designer. And context of use is made of a description of the users and of their tasks, of the environment. And environment not only means the physical environment, but also organizational environment. Or if you think about a workflow, if there are any dependencies between certain steps, you need to know this before you start the design of a system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you already... It's interesting to see if you talk to a software developer and you talk about usability, he usually thinks about how to arrange the widgets in the UI. And you talk about interaction design, so this already hints at the fact that you see this way more broadly than what typically the UI designer thinks it is.
Yeah, this is a typical mistake that software developers often think. If you just have a good, say, user interface style guide, which tells you how to position certain widgets on your surface, that's all. But this is what I would call something like a micro usability.
Yeah.
So it's more about the workflow, and it's more about the interaction, the flow of interaction, the navigation, and things like that, and not just arranging things on a screen.
So the way I actually got aware of UI design was that a customer that I worked with, one of my customers, had a UI prototype created by you. There the challenge was to show a lot of information on a screen, and you were able to focus on different parts of it, and you had to show overview of the stuff you didn't focus on, and then if you select something else, the other stuff had to somehow fade out, but would still be shown in a kind of summary with color codes and stuff. And that was actually really impressive, and that got way beyond what you do with standard Windows controls, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And this brings up another topic. This is a topic of data visualization, which is very important. So, for instance, if you have huge amounts of data, think about thousands or 10,000s of data records, and if you get a search result with several thousands hits, then how could you present them to the user without having it just shown as a list? So you might think of other approaches of visualization.
There is a very related topic I come across all the time. I work a lot in model-driven development, so I have to use UML sometimes. And if you look at today's UML tools, they are still built in a way that, well, the diagrams are basically passive. They look like on a big sheet of paper that can be printed. There is no interaction of the user with the data, like diagrams dynamically opening and hyperbolic trees or something.
Yes, it really becomes very interesting if you can play a little with the data, and just see what the future might bring. So if you manipulate the data and visualize how a certain result would change in future if you manipulate the data. This is a thing with which we deal when we talk about data visualization and how to interactively play with the data.
And many tools don't do that. They're still in this paper metaphor. That's a pity. Okay, so when I prepared the episode by looking at some of your material, there were a couple of things I wanted to hint at. One is that when designing a system, there are 3 dimensions: user, task, and environment. Can you maybe talk about those 3 and how they interact, and also maybe putting the idea of personas into this discussion?
Some people already know about Alan Cooper, one of the grandfathers of the persona idea. Meanwhile, I've just noticed that John Pruitt released a book about the persona life cycle. It's more than 700 pages book only dealing with the creation of personas and their life cycle. starting from the childhood to the adulthood. So it's a topic of itself. But other people might not know what a persona is. So a persona is a stereotypic user, but it's derived from, for instance, from interviews or from material from your marketing department. So if you already have a certain model or certain idea about your target groups and about the characteristics of your target groups, then you try to build a persona which typically represent one typical user of a certain target group. And this persona, it's not abstract, but it has certain characteristics, so you can somehow immerse into this person, so you get an idea how this persona might interact with a system. And this persona can be taken up in your team in order to discuss how a user with that particular background might interact with the system. And it also helps to discuss the system design with your customers. So you can take these personas in order to help people immerse into a particular user and imagine how this particular user might interact with a system. So personas is a really helpful means in order to think about your future users.
And just to maybe emphasize it, it's not like the use case guy, you know, the stick figure where you say bank account user and that's it. You really build, I don't know, you write 50 pages about the guy's background, about how he thinks. So it's way further, way more.
Yeah, and I have a brief anecdote just from one of our customers, and they really built up personas really man-sized physically. And so if the software developers made a fault in the interaction concept and they just got one of these personas and put this persona right behind the neck of the software developer, and they said, watch your persona, or he is watching you and just looking over your shoulder if you do the things right in the way the users want to have it.
So personas are the way how you represent users basically in the design process.
Yes, you represent users and you take them in order to discuss a certain scenario. And I just want to take this issue about the use case and scenario. We call it scenario or even narrative scenario. So the use case is like an abstract modeling of the interaction flow of a system, whereas in a scenario we try to describe a certain episode in the interaction about the interaction with a system. So it's a real, or say this persona, but with a real task and real data. So it's not abstract data, but these scenarios help to think about how the system will be used in future and how users will work with the system with a particular concrete data set. And starting with this narrative scenario, we call it narrative scenario because it's like an episode,
like a story,
a story. It's a story. It should not be too long, just half a page or things like that, or a page, not a 20 pages story, or because that would be hard to model. So if you have this half-page story, you can take that story and build from that a storyboard, and which shows screen by screen how the system would behave.
Since your company does this kind of as its main focus and full time, of course we come to expect that you have a process, an engineering process for doing it. It's the UI. What is it called? UIEM, right? The user interface engineering model, I guess.
It's a user interface engineering model, right?
Yeah. And so I think to give people a somewhat more thorough understanding of all this stuff, why don't we step through it in some detail, so people understand what's going on or what's involved in actually, doing UI or interaction design the right way. So I guess the first part is the planning of the overall system.
Yeah, but before we start with the UAM, I just want to stress, as we are a service provider, and sometimes we only offer some usability services to a customer. For instance, if a customer does also develop by its own or by its own teams, and they just want to have a usability test, for instance, just a test in order to see whether users can really work with the system. We just do the usability test, or if we do the software development of the user interface, also we always have to adapt to the processes of our customers. So our user interface engineering model, it helps us to discuss with the customer which kind of services with regard to usability they want to get from us. And if they do not have such or any development process, and you may laugh, but this happens. Then we can talk about the typical phases with regard to product development, and we have split the model up into the basic four phases, which you may know from the rational unified process or other agile processes, and just to see in which phase the customer currently is with his product development, and how we can help them in order to get a better usability into the product.
In other words, like with every reference model, it's not intended to necessarily be done completely in sequence, but it's a way of thinking about the overall problem.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So first phase. It's probably I think it's called elicitation in
it's the elicitation in the rational unified process. It's what we call something like the planning phase, and this is also a very critical starting point, that customers often do not think about usability goals. So in the elicitation phase, we wouldn't like to urge our customers not only to think about business goals, although a usability goal might also become a business goal, but also to think about what they want to achieve as a new product with regard to usability. And it's not just to be easy to use. So there might be other goals, and this is hard to find out for the customers, because certainly the Dilbert cartoon with many requirements, thousands of requirements, and at the end of the cartoon, Dilbert is mentioning that one important requirement has been missing, and this is the easy to use requirement, but that's not just easy to use, but it's far more. For instance, you want to reduce the training effort for a complex system, so it's also not only efficiency, because there is an ISO norm which defines usability as the degree of effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction with which users can accomplish tasks. But it's not only efficiency and effectiveness and even satisfaction. Today we talk more about the joy of use or joyability. We think user interfaces should motivate users in order to work with them, especially when you think about commercial products in the consumer electronics era. So usability goals is one thing with which you should start just to think about it, and or to initiate the process to think about usability goals. The other thing is, of course, it's requirements with regard not only functional requirements, but if you take into account the FERPS model of the rational unified processes, functional requirements and usability, safety and reliability, and things like that then usability requirements is one set of the requirements, and the description of the target user groups. So you should know which target user groups you want to address, and things like that. So this is.
Yep.
I just wanted to explain one thing more. It's because we haven't called that usability engineering model, but user interface engineering model. You might have noticed that, and this is because it's all about the user interface, and this means it's not just usability, but it's also visual design, it's graphic design, and it's also the technical part of it. So we basically have 3 lines in this model. It's one which regards usability, another one regards the design issues, and the next one regards the software development process. And I want to raise one thing about the design line. This is which emotional aspects should be evoked with a graphical design, and so also the design line starts very early in order to find out which requirements a customer might have with regard to the visual design. How should it look like, and how should the future user interface look like, and also which adjectives do you want to associate with the user interface? Should it be cool?
Right, like Web 2.0 versus more banking systems, right? Yeah.
So this is all in the very start of in the early start of the project to know about the design facts, about the design requirements with regard to visual design, but also with regard to the technology which should be used. Is it a WPF? Is it Silverlight? Is it something different? And because this also builds the design space, which we need to take into account when we start.
Because it limits the things you can do.
It limits things, yes. Yeah, exactly.
So the next phase?
Yeah, next phase would be what usually is called the modeling phase. Yeah. And here, with regard to the user interface, you have numerous number of methods which you could apply. By the way, I would like to explain how the model is constructed. So we have these phases, and for each phase and each line, so we have these 3 lines: usability, design, and software development. In each of these lines, you have certain activities per phase. So, for instance, one activity could be the requirements analysis in one line. And in order to do a requirements analysis, you have certain methods. For instance, if you want to do an interview with a user, then doing an interview is a method. But as you can use this method not only during the requirements phase, but you can also use an interview, for instance, in an evaluation phase. This is that methods are independent from a phase. You just have a certain number of methods which you might apply in a certain phase and for a certain line. And even within a method, you might have tasks which can which are needed for different methods. For instance, if you want to recruit users for doing such an interviews, or if you want to recruit users for a focus group, or you want to recruit users for doing a usability test. So recruitment would be a task which could appear in different methods. So this is how the model is built. You have activities. For doing these activities, we have methods, and within a method you might have tasks.
Okay.
So with regard to modeling, if we just take up this persona issue, which we have been talking about, then personas, So the creation of personas is one starting point, or could be one starting point. Also the creation of narrative scenarios, which then lead to storyboards. So these storyboards, they show the behavior of the system screen by screen, but not in a visual designed way, but rather in an abstract way, what we call wireframes. So it's
basically a sketch or a Visio diagram or something.
Yeah, you could even do it on paper.
Right.
So paper prototyping is really cheap and fast means, and we try to convince our customers that it's worthy to start on paper instead of using computer-based tools, but just have some scribbles on paper and discuss with your customer.
Do you know this book, The Back of the Napkin? It's about visual communication and how to convince people of your ideas using visuals.
Yeah.
And the guy...
Would be interesting to read.
And this guy also talks about forget about Visio and PowerPoint. Just take a pen and a paper.
And there's also a book by Karen Snyder called Paper Prototyping. So it's a book just dealing only with the issue of paper prototyping and also how to do usability tests with a paper prototype. So you do not need to have an interactive prototype which is programmed, but you can do usability tests like in a Wizard of Oz manner with a paper with a paper prototype.
And I guess the photoshopped visuals also appear in this phase, or are they later?
No, they appear in this phase, but just to have one certain screen designed in order to discuss the aesthetics of the feature interface. We do not do the storyboard with Photoshop designed screens.
So the Photoshop stuff is really about the visual graphic design to give an impression about that. And then the logical structure of the screen and the stuff is done with the more simpler means.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else interesting in that phase?
Yes, at the end of the phase, we should have something like a user interface specification or a style guide or both. It depends. So sometimes a customer already has a style guide, or sometimes we derive a style guide from the prototypes in order to describe patterns, best practices for designing a user interface for a product family, like that. But also here, I think it's important to explain the difference between a style guide and a specification. But I think
I was about to ask.
I expected that. Okay, the style guide again, it's more abstract. It's just describing, for instance, how a certain widget should be used. So what is the purpose of a certain widget? So if you think about a tree control, what can you do with a tree control in an abstract way? What happens in the tree control if you click on one of these small signs? But it does not put the tree control into context, and this is what the user interface specification does.
So the specification describes the whole system, and the style guide is basically a collection of patterns in the software engineering patterns kind of way that says whenever you use a tree control, do it this way so it's consistent.
The style guide is about consistency across products or within a product family.
But I guess that the style guides you talk about here are more domain or application or product specific than, for example, a Java Swing style guide or a Windows style guide. It's tailored to the kinds of stuff the application needs to do.
Often the Java Swing style guide or Windows style guide, Vista style guide is taken as a basis, and then it's developed further in order to cover the particular needs of a customer.
Okay, next phase is the actual construction or implementation or the building of the system.
often we face a problem that even if a user interface specification exists, or even if a style guide exists, then still some, say, degree of interpretation freedom is left to the developers, and this is where we support the development team in order to clarify issues. For instance, if the user interface specification is not complete specification of all screens, and they have to adapt to new workflows, then new questions arise, and this is where the usability engineer might support the software development team in order to derive solutions from former already specified user interface to the new workflow.
To extrapolate from what's already there. And then, of course, implementing the user interface is basically kind of, in that sense, it's trivial. Somebody has to program it. I mean, it's a lot of work, of course, but it's not necessarily a lot of work for you guys.
Yeah. What I also want to raise here is a test topic.
Right.
So in the construction phase, you have testing, and especially with regard to usability testing, we distinguish between two different ways of doing a usability test, or say it's the objective of the usability test. One is more formative, a formative test. This is a kind of usability test which we use in the modeling phase. It is, it has very much to do with the agile idea. It's you test in order to change, but not in order to prove that the system has met all requirements. And if you want to do testing like in a quality assurance way, then this is we call summative test, because it's at more or least at the end of the development phase, so to have a kind of field test with more users, whereas if you have this formative testing, you only need to have 6 or 8 users, or maybe even 4. It's important just to have some users and to see whether they can work with the system, and to take the results of such a formative test in order to drive the development process.
And how do you actually test the UI? Do you put users in front of it and measure how long it takes them to do something and how happy they are after doing it? Or, I mean, how do you do it?
Yeah, it's a mixture of an interview and also using questionnaires. And but the most important thing is that users try to work with the system with real tasks. So you before you start with a usability test, you have a session, and then in the session is a moderator who leads the participant through the usability test, and then the participant of such a test, they try to solve a task, and what is really important is that we ask them to think aloud, to think aloud what they expect from the user interface. For instance, if they do not find a particular option within a menu, we ask them about what they look for. So sometimes it's just a wording issue. It's so that the wrong labels have been chosen. And this thinking aloud technique is important to get an idea about the user's expectations. And so they try to solve a task, and then we measure whether they succeed without help, whether they need some help, or whether they cannot succeed even with a lot of help. So it's the number of errors or the number of help needed with regard to the completion of a task is one issue. And we also use at the end of the test, we often use a questionnaire, which is called Attractive. There's also a website on it, and the Attractive questionnaire is used in order to measure the the attractiveness of a product which is built up from the pragmatic aspects and hedonic aspects. And the pragmatic aspects is whether all the functions are available that users need, and the hedonic aspects is whether they like to work with it. And this is a questionnaire which has been validated also by us, and there is a website about it.
It's a very generic one. It's not specific.
But of course, you can also use. You can only use it if you really have a visually designed user interface in order to get a rating.
And then I guess, the last deployment phase is probably rather straightforward.
Yeah, the deployment phase might lead again to the planning phase, as you know. So it's important to get back feedback from the users and to like in an issue tracking way. Yeah.
Okay. So that was basically our stepping through the UI engineering model. A couple of more questions. One is, if you're an agile shop, you're doing XP or something, then all of this sounds very heavyweight. And of course, you aligned it with the rational unified process, so it kind of, to an agile person, it has to sound heavyweight. So how do you integrate that, or how do you convince an agile team, an XP team or whatever, to put that into their schedule, into their process? How would you make this feel more agile?
Yeah, one important thing is that even in an agile process, you I would say you must think about the user, and not in an abstract way, but really to bring a user into the team. For instance, if you consider a Scrum model and you define a sprint, and you might even define as a sprint some activities in which you involve the users, and at the end of this sprint you should have results from from a usability test.
It's like a spike, but it's a spike in usability.
Exactly. And but a problem which is often discussed is with regard to agile processes and usability. That the question that is asked is, what happens if the user interface as such changes with each iteration? Can we do that, or shouldn't we do that? But I think this depends on whether really with each iteration you have market-ready product or not. So as long as you are not on the market, I would say it's okay to change the user interface.
To me, somehow this whole discussion about how something like that fits into the agile process is a little bit similar to how do you fit in requirements engineering and how do you fit in architecture. You know, these somewhat more, let's say, strategic aspects of software development. How do you fit those into the relatively fine granular work attitude of agile processes? And I guess that some of the answer is that, you know, some things aren't useful to do in one day iterations. You sometimes have to do something a little bit more strategically.
Yeah, what has happened with regard to agile process is that now we have something like agile usability engineering. For instance, Scott Ambler has
he also has agile modeling and agile architecture.
Okay, so it's everything is getting agile.
Sure. As I said, I saw some of your work with this customer, and to me, I mean, it really was impressive, and it convinced me personally that, at least in that situation, it makes a lot of sense to have professional usability folks involved. So how do I convince my project manager or my boss? I mean, because most people say, well, you know, it's not important as long as we can click here. And, you know, most people, I would argue, or many people don't really care, at least initially, until they notice there are problems. How do I convince my boss?
The first thing is pretty easy. It's the user interface. It's like the calling card of your product. It's the first thing your customer or your user interacts with. So if the user interface is not convincing, then people might refrain from buying. such a product. But they say, okay, then I call a designer and who makes some nice
That's
icons.
exactly
and
my point. Yes.
Yeah, but
that you need. I mean, convincing somebody to get a graphics guy in to have a couple of nice icons, nice colors. Okay, people get that. But to go further and really do more than that and think about efficient interactions and stuff, that's, I think, for me, that's a tougher challenge to sell to my customers or consulting clients or something.
So with regard to the web, it's also rather easy to convince your customers. So if you talk about the conversion rate, if you think about e-business, if you think about shops, and there have been a number of studies which show how often customers do not succeed in buying a product in a shop. You may know Jacob Nielsen's alert box. There you can find a number of these things.
Yeah. Are there any numbers where people can, or where you can show that, there's product X before user interface design involvement, 5 clicks or 5 customers, and after it was improved more, like numbers to show that this stuff is actually useful?
You can find such numbers in a book, for instance, by Byers and Mayhew. It's cost justifying usability. There's a lot of such numbers, but also in the internet there is in the Usability Professionals Association website, the upasoc.org, or also UsabilityNet is another website where you can find
put some of those in the show notes.
But it's also sometimes it's the customer who wants to prove that the cost of usability of the usability measures that it really pays off. And to give you one example, we have designed call center software, and one usability goal from the customer was that we should be able to show that the training time, the training effort is really reduced by means of redesigned user interface. And what we did when we had finished the user interface design, we did test in parallel with the former system and with a new system, and we started having people. So you may consider summertime when students help in the call center, and if a student just works for, say, 6 weeks or things like that. Call center does not work to have a training phase of 4 weeks. So we did this test in parallel with the old system and with the new system, having an initial test in order to see how people can work with the system without any training. And then after that we had some more measure points in order to see how effectively and how efficiently the people work with the system, and we could show that we were able to decrease the learning curve by 50%. So, and this really pays off.
Yeah, it pays off. Yeah. So, is there any material people can look at, except maybe for some of the websites you already mentioned? So, if people want to get involved in this stuff, is there any books, for example? Hint, hint.
There's a number of books. There's a book of my own, but this is in German. It's called User Interface Tuning. In fact, it's I'm the editor of this book, and it's showing some stories how companies used usability, or how they applied usability engineering in order to build better usable products. But of course, there is numerous number of English books. So you have books by Jacob Nielsen for the web design, Alan Cooper I've been mentioning before, or Jennifer Priest, you may know. I don't know do you put links on?
Yeah, we'll put those books. I'll annoy you after the show at some point. We'll put the stuff into the show notes.
So I will pass some links to use.
Okay, so that's basically all. Is there anything else you want to say as closing words to our listeners?
There's only one closing word. Ask your user.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for downloading and listening to Software Engineering Radio. Software Engineering Radio is an educational program brought to you by Hillside Europe. If you want more information about the podcast and all the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and /dot buttons. To contact the team, please send email to team@se-radio.net, or if it is specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can react to your comments. This episode of SE Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons 2.5 license. Please see the website for details. Thanks to Charlie Crow and the PodSafe Music Network for the music used in this show. The song is called Vegas Hard Rock Shuffle.